The United Kingdom woke up to a political earthquake this morning, and the aftershocks are still tearing through Westminster. Scotland has just delivered a blow so devastating, so unexpected, that it's left the entire British establishment reeling. What happened in the last 48 hours isn't just another headline. This is the moment everything changes. The carefully constructed unity of the United Kingdom is cracking wide open, and what comes next could reshape the map of Britain forever. London thought they had control. They thought Scotland would fall in line, accept the status quo and move on. They were catastrophically wrong. And right now, as politicians scramble behind closed doors and emergency meetings are called at the highest levels of government, one question echoes through every corridor of power. How did we miss this? Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal goes deeper than anything you've seen in the mainstream media. This isn't just politics as usual. This is the beginning of something that will define the next decade of British history. Let me take you back to where this all started. Because to understand the magnitude of what just happened, you need to understand the powder keg that's been building for years. Scotland and Westminster have been on a collision course since the day after the 2014 independence referendum. Yes, Scotland voted to remain in the United Kingdom back then, 55% to 45%. London breathed a sigh of relief. The union was saved. But here's what they didn't understand: that referendum didn't settle the question. It ignited something far more powerful. It gave millions of Scots a taste of what self-determination could look like. And once people have tasted that kind of possibility, you can't just take it away and expect them to forget. Then came Brexit. And this is where the cracks really started to show. Remember, Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. 62% of Scots wanted to stay, but they were dragged out anyway, pulled along by the English vote, with no say in the final outcome that would fundamentally reshape their economy, their rights and their future. The Scottish government protested. The Scottish Parliament voted against it. It didn't matter. Westminster had the final word, and that word was tough luck. You are coming with us whether you like it or not. That moment crystallised something in the minds of millions of Scots. They realised that inside the United Kingdom, their voice would always be secondary. Their democratic will would always be overruled if it conflicted with what England wanted. And that realisation has been growing, spreading and hardening ever since. Fast forward to recent months, and the pressure has been building to unbearable levels. The Scottish National Party has been relentless in pushing for another independence referendum, arguing that Brexit changed everything and that Scotland deserves another chance to choose its future. Nicola Sturgeon, before she stepped down, had turned this into a laser-focused mission. Her successor continued that momentum. Meanwhile, in Westminster, the response has been equally stubborn. Prime Minister after Prime Minister has refused to grant the legal authority for another referendum. The official line has always been the same: now is not the time. The people spoke in 2014. We need to focus on recovering from the pandemic and stabilising the economy. But to many in Scotland, that sounded less like reasonable governance and more like England telling Scotland to sit down and be quiet. Then came the economic pressures. Scotland's economy has been struggling under policies set in London. The cost of living crisis hit Scotland hard. Energy bills skyrocketed, even as Scotland generates massive amounts of renewable energy that gets exported to England. Public services face cuts, while Westminster pursued austerity measures that the Scottish government vocally opposed but couldn't overrule. The disconnect between what Scotland wanted and what Westminster delivered grew wider with each passing month. Independent supporters had a simple message: why should we accept decisions made by a government we didn't vote for, implementing policies we don't support that hurt our people? It's a powerful argument, and it's been resonating across Scotland in ways that should have terrified the strategists in London, but somehow they convinced themselves it was under control. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. Quiet conversations were taking place in Edinburgh, in Brussels, in Dublin, even in Washington. Scotland was building relationships, laying groundwork, preparing for the possibility of independence in ways that went far beyond rhetoric. Trade delegations were travelling Economic analyses were being prepared. Constitutional lawyers were drafting frameworks. This wasn't just talk anymore, this was preparation. And still, London either didn't notice or didn't take it seriously. They were so confident in their control, so sure that the legal structures of the United Kingdom would hold everything together, that they failed to see the ground shifting beneath their feet. That was their fatal mistake. Now let's talk about what actually happened in the last 48 hours, because this is where the story gets absolutely explosive. It started with an announcement that seemed to come out of nowhere. The Scottish First Minister called an emergency press conference. No advance warning to Westminster. No consultation with number 10 Downing Street. Just a simple notification, major announcement coming, be ready. Political journalists went into overdrive. Speculation ran wild. Some thought it might be about a new economic package. Others wondered if it was related to healthcare or education policy. Nobody, and I mean nobody, predicted what was actually coming. The First Minister stepped up to the podium and the room fell silent, and then the bombshell dropped. Scotland was not asking for permission anymore. The Scottish Government announced it would proceed with preparations for an independence referendum, regardless of whether Westminster granted legal authority. But it went further than that. The announcement included something unprecedented, a detailed timeline, a comprehensive framework, and most shockingly, confirmation that multiple international partners had already signalled support for recognising Scottish independence if it came through a democratic process. This wasn't a threat. This wasn't posturing. This was a declaration that Scotland was moving forward, with or without London's blessing. The reaction was instantaneous and seismic. In Edinburgh, independence supporters poured into the streets. Celebrations erupted across Glasgow, Aberdeen, Dundee. Saltire flags appeared in windows throughout Scotland. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from jubilation to fury, depending on which side of the debate you stood. But in London, panic. Pure, undisguised panic. Emergency meetings were convened within minutes. Cabinet members were pulled from other commitments. The Prime Minister cancelled scheduled appearances because Westminster suddenly realised they were facing a constitutional crisis unlike anything in modern British history. And they had absolutely no prepared response. The legal arguments started flying immediately. Westminster's position has always been that the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the authority to hold a referendum on independence without permission from the UK Parliament. That authority, they argue, is reserved to Westminster under the Scotland Act. Therefore, any referendum held without London's consent would be illegal, illegitimate and non-binding. It's a position they've held firmly for years. But here's where it gets complicated. The Scottish Government's announcement didn't just ignore this legal framework, it challenged the fundamental basis of it. Their argument, laid out in meticulous detail, goes like this. The principle of self-determination is recognised under international law. The people of Scotland constitute a distinct political community with the right to determine their own future. And if Westminster indefinitely refuses to allow that democratic expression, then Westminster is essentially holding Scotland in a union against its will, which undermines the very democratic principles the United Kingdom claims to uphold. Now, you might think this is just clever political rhetoric, but here's what makes it so dangerous for London. It's working. International responses started coming in, and they weren't the blanket dismissals Westminster was hoping for. The European Union issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging the complexity of the situation and emphasising the importance of democratic expression. Ireland's government made supportive noises about respecting Scotland's democratic choices. Even officials in Washington suggested that any democratic process should be respected and that internal UK matters should be resolved through dialogue and mutual respect. These weren't explicit endorsements of Scottish independence, but they weren't rejections either. And that ambiguity is exactly what the Scottish Government was counting on. Because once the international community signals that they might potentially recognise the Scottish vote, even without Westminster's approval, the entire legal and political landscape shifts. Let's dig into what this means for the actual mechanics of how the United Kingdom functions, because this is where things get truly fascinating and deeply concerning depending on your perspective. The The United Kingdom isn't like most countries. It's a union of four nations: England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But that union has always been held together by a combination of shared institutions, economic integration and, crucially, legal frameworks that place ultimate sovereignty in the Westminster Parliament. Scotland has its own parliament with devolved powers over things like health, education and justice. But the big stuff, defence, foreign policy and constitutional matters, that stays in London. It's a system that's worked more or less for over 300 years since the Acts of Union in 1707. But it's always been built on a fundamental assumption that all parties accept Westminster's ultimate authority. Remove that assumption and the entire structure becomes unstable. What Scotland just did was reject that assumption entirely. By announcing they'll proceed regardless of Westminster's position, they've essentially declared that they no longer accept London's authority over Scottish constitutional matters. Think about the implications of that for a moment. If Scotland can decide to hold a referendum without permission, what stops them from making other unilateral decisions? Could they refuse to implement certain UK-wide policies? Could they stop sending MPs to Westminster? Could they establish their own international relationships that contradict UK foreign policy? These questions might sound hypothetical, but they're not anymore. They're live constitutional issues that lawyers and politicians are grappling with right now. And Westminster has no good answers. The economic dimensions of this crisis are equally explosive. Scotland's economy is deeply integrated with the rest of the UK. They share a currency, a central bank, a tax system, trade networks, supply chains, everything. Unpicking that would be phenomenally complex. Independent supporters argue that Scotland is economically viable on its own, pointing to natural resources, renewable energy capacity, a strong financial sector in Edinburgh, and successful small independent countries like Ireland and Norway as models. Unionists argue that Scotland benefits enormously from UK-wide structures, that separation would be economically devastating, and that promises of easy independence are fantasy. Both sides have detailed economic studies supporting their positions. But here's the thing. Economics isn't determining this debate. Identity is. And identity doesn't care about GDP forecasts. The business community is absolutely terrified right now. Uncertainty is poison for investment and planning. Major companies with operations in Scotland are holding emergency board meetings to discuss contingency plans. Banks are reviewing where they're legally domiciled. The financial sector is trying to model what independence would mean for regulations, market access and currency. Nobody has clear answers yet, which means everybody is preparing for multiple scenarios. And that kind of preparation, that hedging of bets, creates its own momentum. When businesses start treating Scottish independence as a realistic possibility rather than a fringe political fantasy, that changes perceptions across the board. It makes the unthinkable start to seem thinkable. Then there's the spillover effect, and this is what really has Westminster losing sleep. If Scotland successfully pushes forward with independence over London's objections, what happens in Northern Ireland? The situation there is already delicate after Brexit, with new trade barriers creating friction and old tensions resurfacing. Northern Irish nationalists have been talking more openly about a potential united Ireland. If Scotland demonstrates that you can leave the United Kingdom through sheer political will and popular support, that creates a template. Wales is quieter on this front, but even there, independence movements that were once marginal are growing. The United Kingdom could be facing not just the loss of Scotland, but the beginning of a complete unravelling. England might end up alone, stripped of the union that has defined British identity for centuries. That's not just a political crisis, that's an existential crisis. So where does this go from here? That's the question everyone in British politics is asking right now. And the honest answer is nobody knows. We're in completely uncharted territory. Westminster is facing a choice between terrible options. They can try to legally block Scotland's referendum, which would require court battles, potential enforcement actions, and risks turning Scotland even further against the Union by appearing authoritarian. They can try to negotiate, offering Scotland more powers, more autonomy, something to make staying in the UK more attractive. But after years of promises and half measures, many Scots are sceptical that any offer from London would be genuine or sufficient. Or Westminster can do something almost unthinkable. They can accept that this is happening and try to manage the separation process to minimise damage to both sides. So right now, indications are that they're preparing for the first option, legal confrontation. But that strategy has massive risks. Scotland's strategy seems to be forcing Westminster's hand while building maximum international sympathy and domestic support. The referendum they're planning won't happen immediately. They're talking about a timeline that gives people time to understand the issues, for economic plans to be detailed, for international relationships to be formalised. This isn't a rash decision. It's calculated. They want to demonstrate that Scottish independence would be orderly, democratic and legitimate. And they're betting that if they can maintain momentum and popular support, Westminster will eventually have to concede that blocking Scotland militarily or through authoritarian legal measures would be far more damaging to the UK's international reputation than allowing a democratic vote. Public opinion in Scotland right now is absolutely critical, and it's shifting in real time. Polls before this announcement were showing independence support hovering around 50%, sometimes slightly above, sometimes slightly below. But constitutional moments like this don't leave opinions static. They force people to choose sides. And the way Westminster responds will matter enormously. If London appears reasonable, willing to discuss, respectful of Scottish democratic wishes, they might hold support for the Union. If they appear dismissive, controlling or threatening, they could push wavering Scots toward independence. Every statement, every policy decision, every tone of voice matters now. The battle for Scottish public opinion is the real battleground, and both sides know it. England's response to all this is going to be fascinating and potentially ugly. Many English people are deeply attached to the idea of the United Kingdom and would be genuinely heartbroken to see Scotland leave. But there's also frustration building. Some English voters are tired of what they see as Scotland getting special treatment, receiving more public spending per capita than England, and constantly threatening to leave while benefiting from the Union. There's a growing sentiment of, if they want to go, let them go. That sentiment could strengthen Westminster's hand in standing firm, or it could mean that English public opinion won't support the kind of compromises that might be necessary to keep Scotland in the Union. Either way, this crisis is revealing and exacerbating divisions, not just between Scotland and England, but within English society about what Britain should be. And here's the final piece that makes this so profound. This is happening against a backdrop of global instability. The international order that emerged after World War II is under strain everywhere. Western democracies are dealing with populism, polarisation and questions about governance that nobody has good answers for. The European Union has been reshaped by Brexit and is still adapting. NATO is focused on security challenges from Russia. The United States is dealing with its own deep internal divisions. Into this fragile moment comes the potential breakup of the United Kingdom, one of the oldest and most stable democracies in the world. The symbolic impact alone would be enormous. It would send a message that even the most established political structures can come apart if the will of the people demands it. That's inspiring to some, terrifying to others, but significant to everyone. This isn't just about Scotland and England anymore. The whole world is watching what happens next because the precedents being set here will echo far beyond these islands. The United Kingdom is at a crossroads, and the path chosen in the coming weeks and months will determine not just the fate of Scotland, but the very concept of what Britain means in the 21st century. The shockwave from Scotland has only just begun to spread, and nobody can predict where it will finally settle.